Looking back at the entire history of crime in the United States, the victims of most serial killers are predominantly women, with very few serial killers specifically targeting men for murder. Therefore, whether it is Jeffrey Dahmer, the cannibal, who killed 17 young men, or Robert Berdella, known as the Kansas City Butcher, or Carl Panzram, who was active in earlier times and full of hatred, the terror they brought is indescribable. However, their crimes either did not reach the peak in scale or were gradually forgotten due to the passage of time. Nevertheless, there is one man who, although extremely vague in the public memory, had a victim count of at least 23 young men, making him one of the deadliest serial killers in the United States known to target male victims. The FBI even stated that his case is the most severe nationwide in terms of the number of deaths and duration over the past 2 decades. He is Ronald Dominique, the Bayou Strangler, whose notoriety is far from matching his crimes. He is an introverted, obese man with an extremely deceptive nature. On January 9, 1964, Ronald was born in a trailer park in Thibodaux, Louisiana. His parents were impoverished laborers. He was the youngest child with 5 older siblings. Because the family was always struggling financially and his parents were busy making ends meet, they had no time to pay attention to Ronald's feelings. As a result, from the time Ronald could remember, his life was tinged with gloom. As time went by, Ronald entered the local high school. However, due to his melancholic personality, poor communication skills, and being overweight, none of his peers wanted to befriend him. Unable to be accepted by his peers, especially since he had no interest in drugs or alcohol, he became the laughingstock of the school and a target for bullying. He was never allowed to attend parties organized by his peers, and his classmates constantly ridiculed him for lacking athletic ability. As graduation approached, Ronald realized that he was attracted to men. Although the gay liberation movement had rapidly developed after the 1969 Stonewall riots in New York, homosexuality was still not accepted by society. Thus, Ronald's sexual orientation made his already difficult life even more challenging. After discovering that he was gay, Ronald began secretly visiting a local gay bar. Unfortunately, some classmates happened to see him entering the bar. Instead of understanding Ronald, these classmates subjected him to even more severe harassment. Although Ronald firmly denied being gay, his explanations did not change his situation of being bullied at school. In 1983, he graduated from high school and was admitted to Nicholls State University, majoring in computer science. However, college life did not bring him any new hope. Instead, it made him feel more isolated. So, he quickly lost interest in college and dropped out in the mid-1980s. Without the support of his studies, Ronald's life became even more aimless. He did not know what kind of job would suit him. Moreover, he had an innate aversion to authority and was never willing to commit to anything. He could not find a stable job. He could only do low-skill labor like his parents in exchange for a meager salary. In June 1985, Ronald took his first step on the path of crime. He was arrested for making obscene phone calls and was fined $75. This experience briefly made him realize the mistakes in his behavior. In the following nearly 10 years, he tried to abide by the law and worked minimum wage jobs, but always failed to stick to them. During the periods when he could not support himself, he would rely on the financial help of his mother and sister and live with them. As a gay man, Ronald was unmarried and childless. He longed for love but could never establish a serious relationship, could only seek temporary solace in bars. He liked to spend most of his free time in gay bars and often dressed up as Patti LaBelle, a singer he adored. However, due to his personality and physique, he could not blend into the local gay community and was often looked down upon. In May 1994, Ronald was arrested and fined for drunk driving. At this point, he had already gradually lost himself. His miserable life, unsuccessful love life, and even the dislike from the group he identified with all pressed tightly on his mind. 2 years later, a half-naked young man jumped out of a house window. He was excited but extremely panicked and claimed that a short and fat man, Ronald, had sexually assaulted him and tried to murder him. After the case, 32-year-old Ronald was arrested by the police with a bail of $100,000, an extremely exorbitant amount. However, when the case was about to be transferred to the court, the prosecutor's office could not find the victim and could not confirm the identity of the victim. So, the case was dismissed in November of that year. But this case dealt a heavy blow to Ronald. Because of his short stature, he was targeted and sexually assaulted by some inmates in jail. Since 1997, in small towns in Louisiana, an uneasy atmosphere would permeate the air after nightfall. The locals, who thought their lives were peaceful and monotonous, had no idea that a demon was reaping innocent lives. In July 1997, 19-year-old African-American David Mitchell left his grandmother's house alone after a relative's birthday party. 2 days later, his body was found in a ditch beside a road in St. Charles Parish. The autopsy report showed water in David's lungs, but with no visible injuries on his body and no traces of drugs or alcohol, his death was initially ruled as accidental drowning. However, David's father was certain it wasn't an accident. He knew his son was a good swimmer. Also, David's pants were pulled down to his ankles when his body was found, which didn't fit the accidental drowning scenario but seemed more like murder. Just 5 months later, another case occurred in St. Charles Parish. Gary Peer, 20-year-old, was found dead with his clothes on and no signs of injury or drugs, but this case also didn't attract enough attention. Ronald, an ordinary-looking man in the small town, often spent his time in gay bars. The bar owner's impression of him was that he was quiet, never caused trouble, and didn't drink alcohol, only soda. However, David and Gary were actually Ronald's victims. When Ronald began his criminal career, he went to gay bars just to look for murder targets. He would lure those people with alcohol, drugs, housing, or the temptation of a so-called girlfriend. Once he successfully persuaded them, he would lead them to his mother and sister's camper, subdue and tie them up, and then rape and murder them. Over 10 years, he murdered at least 23 men, with victims ranging in age from 16 to 46, mostly African Americans. On July 31, 1998, Larry Ranson, a 38-year-old drifter, became Ronald's first bound victim, whose body was found with obvious signs of binding. In early October of the same year, Oliver LeBanks, 27-year-old, was lured into Ronald's car. At that time, Oliver, fired for drug use and in financial trouble, had turned to sex work. After having sex with Oliver, Ronald beat and strangled him to death. After killing Oliver, Ronald murdered 16-year-old Joseph Brown, 18-year-old Bruce Williams, and 21-year-old Manuel Reed in the same way. In June 1999, 21-year-old Angel Maya became another of Ronald's victims. This case gave the police a clue. Angel, Joseph, and Gary all lived close to each other, suggesting that the killer's area of activity was relatively fixed. In September of the same year, the naked body of Mitchell Johnson, 34-year-old, was found in a forest near Metairie. Several months later, the tranquility of Lafourche Parish was also shattered. Michael Vincent, 23-year-old, disappeared after a late-night walk, and his body was found a few days later, with the cause of death being asphyxiation. In early October 2000, Ronald chose his murder target to be his neighbor, which was by far his boldest decision. At that time, 20-year-old Kenneth Randolph Jr. lived in the trailer park near him. Ronald, taking advantage of his neighborly status, lured Kenneth into his trailer and carried out the assault and murder. Afterwards, he dumped Kenneth's body in a field outside the city. Initially, the local police conducted an investigation and even questioned Ronald. However, they never anticipated that this seemingly simple-minded man was the real culprit behind the multiple murders. Nevertheless, the police questioning still intimidated Ronald, causing him to refrain from committing further crimes for over a year. On February 10, 2002, Ronald was arrested by the police again. It was not because his crimes had been exposed, but because he had assaulted a woman. It was said that the reason for the assault was that he saw the woman driving dangerously in the parking lot and hitting a baby stroller. So he rushed over, argued with her, and punched her. Later, although Ronald was prosecuted, the case was dismissed because Ronald reached a settlement agreement with the woman. On October 12th of the same year, on the streets of Houma, 26-year-old Anoka Jones became Ronald's next victim. Like the previous victims, he was lured by Ronald, willingly bound, and then strangled to death. This was also the reason why Ronald was able to successfully kill so many men. 1 month later, Ronald and his sister moved to the rural, unincorporated community of Bayou Bleu, where Ronald found a job inspecting the local power supply. This job allowed him to travel regularly and provided him with more opportunities to commit crimes. Around the same time, Ronald killed 19-year-old Datrell Woods, whose body was dumped in a reed field. His body was not discovered until May 24, 2003, and the cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation. Since Woods had asthma, the case was initially treated as an accident until Ronald was arrested and the truth came to light. Over the next 2 years, Ronald murdered 9 people: Larry Matthews, Michael Barnett, Leon Lorette, August Watkins, Kurt Cunningham, Alonzo Hogan, Wayne Smith, Chris DeVille, and Nicholas Pellegrin. Among them, Leon was initially suspected by the police of being the murderer of Anoka because he had lived with 2 other victims, Michael and Anoka. Ronald's last confirmed victim was 27-year-old Christopher Sutterfield. In the summer of 2006, Christopher met Ronald, and they began dating. However, on October 14th, just a few months later, while they were on a date in Iberville Parish, Ronald suddenly struck Christopher on the head with a blunt object, causing him to lose consciousness and die instantly. After Christopher's body was found, local police interviewed his relatives, friends, and acquaintances. They all confirmed that the last time they saw Christopher, he was with a man driving a black sport utility vehicle, but they couldn't remember what the man looked like. Louisiana in 2006 was filled with a tense and oppressive atmosphere. Ronald's crimes were like an endless nightmare, but fortunately, it finally came to an end. In November 2006, Ricky Wallace, a resident of Bayou Blue, reported his terrifying encounter with Ronald to the police. Wallace claimed that Ronald lured him into his trailer with the promise of sharing drugs and having sex with a girl. However, once inside Ronald's trailer, Ronald kept persuading him to tie himself up because the girl liked bondage play. Feeling strange, Wallace didn't agree to Ronald's proposal. He suggested leaving, and Ronald didn't stop him. Later, Wallace, thinking something was off, reported his experience to the police. His story was initially met with skepticism because there might really be a girl who liked that kind of play. But with 23 murders having occurred, the police couldn't afford to ignore any potentially useful leads. They decided to conduct a further investigation into Ronald. Later, Ronald was brought to the police station for questioning. During his detention, he agreed to donate blood for DNA testing. The following week, the results surprised all the investigators as the tests linked Ronald to multiple murders. The DNA evidence showed a perfect match between Ronald's and that left by the killer on the remains of Oliver and Manuel. December 1, 2006, Ronald was arrested at a homeless shelter. He appeared unusually calm, even somewhat relieved at the time of his arrest. He told the police that he had known he would be caught sooner or later and had moved out of his sister's house to avoid causing her any inconvenience. Upon arriving at the police station, Ronald unexpectedly expressed his willingness to cooperate with the investigation. He confessed to the 23 murders, though the details were known only to the police. Nevertheless, Ronald refused to admit to the assaults. He argued that many of the victims had willingly agreed to be bound, handcuffed, and treated in such a manner because they wanted money. He insisted that if the victims refused, he would let them go without harming them, and which also corroborated Wallace's experience. During the interrogation, Ronald revealed his motives for the murders. He claimed that he wanted to eliminate all witnesses because he did not want to go to prison again. He said that after his 1996 arrest for rape, he had been strongly affected, remaining in a negative emotional state, and even beginning to exhibit symptoms of mental disorders. "I was afraid of going back to prison," Ronald told the officer interrogating him. "I didn't want to go through that pain again." Why Ronald was not arrested for 10 years? The first reason was that multiple law enforcement jurisdictions did not coordinate their investigations, and their information was not shared. Secondly, although Ronald had been briefly incarcerated several times, his blood and fingerprints were never taken. On September 24, 2008, Ronald avoided the death penalty by pleading guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 8 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He is currently serving his sentence in a Louisiana prison and will spend the rest of his life there.